If Charity had known that morning would be the last time she would see her own natural glow in the mirror, she would have never walked into that studio. She would have stayed away from the brushes and the powders. The small shop in Ikeja was very quiet, too quiet. 22-year-old Ibele sat in the corner of her empty studio, staring at her rusted makeup kit and her thin, trembling hands. Her bank account was empty, and her stomach felt even emptier. Ibele whispered to the shadows, "When will it be my turn?" She thought success would come soon. She thought she would be the one painting the faces of the rich and famous in Victoria Island. But that night in the back alley changed everything. She found the mirror. 3 months had passed since she made the pact. Ibele's father barely spoke to her anymore, confused by the expensive cars and the coldness in his daughter's eyes. Their home felt different, filled with the heavy scent of jasmine perfumes, but missing the warmth of the girl who used to sing while she worked. Ibele missed her old self, but the power was too addictive. At night, she would cry into her pillow, but sometimes she felt like someone or something was stroking her face while she slept. When she opened her eyes, only the glowing reflection in the mirror was there, smiling back with a beauty that wasn't hers. Before the foundation of blood began to change the fabric of her reality, Ibele existed in the cold, quiet periphery of the Lagos beauty scene. Her small studio in Ikeja was a place of dust and unfulfilled ambition, where the mirrors only reflected a girl who felt like a ghost in her own life. While the sun beat down on the vibrant streets outside, Ibele watched from behind her window as the big girls of Lagos bypassed her door. They were heading to Charity's flourishing salon, a place of gold-rimmed mirrors and constant laughter that sat just 3 blocks away. Charity was everything Ibele was not, naturally radiant, effortlessly successful, and possessed of a glow that seemed to draw the very light out of the air. Ibele's own kit was a collection of cracked palettes and drying lipsticks, tools that felt as useless as her dreams. Her father, a man of few words and dwindling hope, would look at her empty appointment book and sigh, a sound that cut deeper than any insult. "Perhaps it is not meant to be, Ibele," he would say softly, his voice echoing in the hollow silence of their home. But Ibele didn't want comfort. She wanted the world to look at her the way they looked at Charity. She spent her nights scrolling through social media, her eyes burning as she watched videos of Charity applying a simple gloss and receiving thousands of praises. The envy was a physical weight, a jealous stone in her chest that made her feel invisible. She felt like a shadow walking through a city of neon lights. She was the artist with no canvas, a creator with no audience, trapped in a cycle of poverty that threatened to swallow her whole. In those dark hours, the silence of her studio was too quiet, filled only with the desperate whisper of her own voice. "When will it be my turn?" She felt she was being spoiled by her own bitterness, her talent rotting in the shade of Charity's overwhelming success. She didn't just want to be a makeup artist, she wanted to be the queen of faces. She wanted the power to make the world stop and stare. It was this void, this aching, cold, and empty space in her soul that finally drove her into the back alleys of Ikeja one rainy Tuesday. She wasn't looking for a mirror, but the darkness was looking for her, waiting for a heart hungry enough to invite it in. Under the flickering streetlights, as she stepped over the puddles of her old life, Ibele didn't realize she was walking toward a pact that would ensure she was never invisible again, but at a price that would eventually demand every face she had ever envied. The rain began as a soft weep before turning into a relentless Lagos downpour, turning the back alleys of Ikeja into rivers of oil and debris. Ibele trudged through the muck, her heart a heavy stone of resentment after another day of being bypassed by the world. It was behind a stack of rotting crates that she saw it, a glimmer that didn't belong to the gloom. Propped against an ancient brick wall was an ancient mirror, its frame a twisted mass of blackened silver that looked like reaching fingers. The glass was clouded with age, yet when Ibele wiped away the grime, the reflection she saw wasn't her tired, hollow-eyed face. For a fleeting second, she saw a version of herself so beautiful it made her breath catch, a woman with skin like polished mahogany and eyes that held the spark of 1,000 stars.
"You want it, don't you?" a voice whispered, sounding like the rustle of dry parchment. It didn't come from the alley, but from inside her own mind. "The glow you crave is just a heartbeat away. But beauty cannot be created from nothing, Ebele. It must be taken." Ebele didn't recoil. The jealous fire in her chest was too hot for fear. She touched the cold glass, and a pact was sealed in the silence of the rain. She dragged the heavy artifact back to her studio, her muscles aching, but her spirit alight with a dark, newfound purpose. The first harvest happened the following morning. Blessing, a young apprentice from Charity's salon, had come over to borrow a specific shade of ochre, her face bright with the naive confidence of the successful. "Just a touch of highlight," Ebele suggested, her voice smooth and predatory as she gestured toward the velvet chair. As Blessing sat, the mirror seemed to pulse. Ebele picked up her brush, and as the bristles swept across Blessing's cheek, the girl's reflection in the ancient glass began to scream silently. Ebele watched with a mixture of horror and ecstasy as a faint, golden vapor rose from Blessing's skin, drawn into the bristles of the brush like iron filings to a magnet. Blessing didn't notice. She only felt a momentary wave of exhaustion, a too quiet heaviness in her limbs. But Ebele felt everything. With every stroke, the sallow skin on Ebele's own arms began to tighten and glow. The wrinkles of stress around her mouth vanished. She was literally drinking the girl's youth through the air. When Blessing finally stood up, she looked slightly dimmed, as if a lamp inside her had been turned low, but Ebele stood before her, transformed. For the first time, Ebele's father looked at her that evening and didn't sigh. He saw a daughter who was finally starting to shine, never realizing that her radiance was built on the foundation of another's decay. The mirror stood in the corner, no longer clouded, but hungry for more. Word spread through the humid streets of Lagos like a wildfire fueled by vanity. It started as a whisper in the markets of Ikeja and soon became a roar in the penthouses of Victoria Island. Ebele, the once invisible girl with the rusted kit, had transformed into a magician of the flesh. Her studio was no longer too quiet. It was a sanctuary of high-end whispers and the constant chime of expensive notifications. The dusty floor was now covered in plush rugs, and the air was thick with the scent of her new signature perfumes, a cloying, honeyed jasmine that seemed to settle in the back of the throat, masking a faint, metallic tang of iron. Clients who entered her shop came out looking like celestial beings. Their skin didn't just look healthy, it vibrated with a luminosity that seemed to defy the harsh afternoon sun. They called it the Ebele glow, and every socialite, bride, and influencer was desperate to possess it. Ebele moved among them like a silent priestess, her own beauty now so sharp it was almost painful to look at. Her eyes were clearer, her movements more fluid, and her voice held a hypnotic resonance that made women trust her with their very lives. As her fame climbed, so did her father's pride, though it was tinged with a strange, lingering unease. Mr. Bello watched as the house filled with designer bags and gold-trimmed mirrors. Yet he noticed that the sweet smell of Ebele's success was so heavy it made the household plants wither in their pots. Ebele ignored the dying leaves. She was too busy basking in the adoration of the city. She was no longer the shadow, she was the sun. But the price of this glory was hidden in the storeroom, tucked away in the ancient mirror that now sat draped in black silk when not in use. At night, Ebele would sit alone in the dark, the scent of her pursed perfumes clinging to her hair, and she would listen. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the faint, rhythmic pulse of the lives she had siphoned. Every time she sprayed her fragrance, she felt a rush of stolen vitality, a warm hug of dark energy that reassured her she would never be poor or plain again. She had become the queen of faces, but as she looked at her reflection, she sometimes saw a flicker of someone else's grief behind her own eyes, a reminder that her rise was built on a foundation of theft, and the mirror was always hungry for the next sacrifice. As Abele's star reached its zenith, a shadow began to stretch over the life of her first victim. Blessing, once a vibrant presence in the Lagos beauty circuit, began to wither like a flower plucked from its roots and left in the scorching sun. It started with a persistent fatigue that no amount of sleep could cure, a too quiet lethargy that settled into her bones and made even the simplest task of holding a mascara wand feel like lifting a leaden weight. While Abele stood before her mirrors, her skin glowing with a luminescence that seemed to vibrate, Blessing's reflection grew increasingly unrecognizable. Her eyes, once bright with ambition, became sunken and rimmed with a ghostly gray. The honey-toned radiance that had made her a favorite at Charity's salon was replaced by a sallow, parchment-like pallor. When Blessing looked in the mirror, she didn't see the girl who had once borrowed a shade of ochre. She saw a stranger who looked 20 years older, her hair thinning and her spirit extinguished.
Doctors at the clinics in Ikeja were baffled. They ran tests for malaria, for typhoid, for every tropical ailment known to the city, but the results always came back empty. There was no medical name for what was happening to her, because Blessing wasn't suffering from a disease, she was suffering from a theft. Every time Ebele walked onto a red carpet and received a standing ovation for her beauty, Blessing felt another spark of her life force snap and vanish into the ether. The contrast was a cruel irony that the city failed to notice. As Ebele's house grew warmer with success, Blessing's room felt cold and empty, the air thick with a sense of impending loss. Ebele heard the rumors of her rival's decline, but the jealous stone in her heart had turned to ice. She didn't feel guilt. She felt a terrifying, addictive hunger. She noticed that the more Blessing decayed, the more precious and untouchable her own features became. Her cheekbones sharpened into perfect lines, and her skin held a dewy freshness that never seemed to fade, even after an 18-hour workday. One evening, Ebele passed Charity's salon and saw the closed sign hanging crookedly on the door. Inside, she could see Charity sitting in the dark, her head in her hands, grieving for a friend who was dying while still breathing. Ebele didn't stop to offer comfort. Instead, she touched her own flawless face, feeling the warmth of Blessing's stolen youth pulsing beneath her fingertips. She realized then that the mirror's bargain was a zero-sum game. For her to be the sun, everyone else had to become the night. The glamour of Ebele's life had become a gilded cage, and the mirror was its silent, hungry jailer. While the world saw a woman at the peak of her beauty, Ebele saw the truth in the quiet hours of the night. The stolen glow she had harvested from Blessing and the others was flickering. Like a fire fed with damp wood, the radiance was starting to smoke at the edges. She noticed a faint gray shadow returning to her own temples, a stubborn hollowness in her cheeks that no amount of standard foundation could mask. The mirror's voice, once a seductive whisper, had grown into a jagged, demanding rasp. "Temporary," it hissed. "The beauty of the weak is like a candle in the wind. If you want to touch eternity, you need the sun itself." Ebele knew exactly who the sun was. It was Charity. Despite the tragedy of Blessing's decay, Charity had remained a beacon of genuine light. Her salon was struggling, her heart was breaking, but her pure soul seemed to repel the shadows that Ebele now lived in.
Charity's beauty wasn't just skin deep, it was a resilience, a warmth that came from a life lived with meaning rather than theft. Ebele realized then that the ordinary harvests were no longer enough. To sustain her power forever, to stop the inevitable return of her old invisible self, she needed to take the forbidden prize. She needed to drain the woman who had been her rival, her inspiration, and the only person who had ever offered her a sincere smile. The realization felt like a cold and empty weight in her stomach, but the addiction to her own fame was stronger than her conscience. She looked at her forbidden palette, a tray of colors that seemed to bleed into one another, waiting for the one ritual that would cement her destiny as the Queen of Faces. If she could just get Charity into her chair, she wouldn't just be taking a few years of youth, she would be siphoning the very essence of what made Charity special. She began to plot with a predatory patience. She sent messages of fake sympathy, flowers for Blessing's bedside, and invitations for a collaboration that would supposedly save Charity's failing business. She whispered to the shadows in her studio, perfecting the jasmine-scented trap. Ebele told herself it was for her survival, but in the reflection of the ancient glass, she saw her own eyes flashing with an insatiable, jealous hunger. She was no longer just a makeup artist, she was a harvester of souls, preparing to dim the brightest light in Lagos to ensure her own flame would never go out. The mirror pulsed in anticipation, its silver frame reaching out like grasping fingers, ready to claim the pure soul that would turn Ebele's stolen beauty into an immortal mask. The heavy velvet curtains of the studio remained drawn long after the bustling streets of Lagos had fallen into a restless slumber. Inside, the air was thick, nearly suffocating under the weight of 1,000 unlit candles and the pervasive, cloying scent of jasmine that had become Ebele's second skin. The only light came from the ancient mirror, which seemed to emit a low, bioluminescent hum, casting distorted shadows that danced against the walls like reaching hands. Ebele moved through the darkness with a feverish, rhythmic intensity, her movements no longer those of a mere artist, but of a woman possessed by a terrifying hunger. She knelt before the forbidden palette, its colors swirling and churning as if alive. With a trembling hand, she dipped a brush into a shade that looked like liquid obsidian and began to paint symbols onto the glass of the mirror. As she worked, she whispered to the shadows that gathered in the corners of the room, her voice a jagged rasp that sounded like dry leaves skittering over pavement. "More," she urged, her eyes wide and reflecting the dark fire of the glass. "More. The glow is fading. I can feel the gray returning to my bones. I need the sun. I need Charity."
The shadows seemed to answer, a low vibration that rattled the glass jars of pigments on her shelves. Ebele didn't flinch. The jealous stone in her heart had grown so cold it felt like a physical weight, anchoring her to this dark pact. She began to chant names, the names of every woman who had sat in her chair and left a piece of their soul behind. Blessing, Funke, Amaka. With each name, the mirror pulsed with a sickly light, and Ebele felt a momentary rush of warmth, a warm hug from the abyss that reassured her of her power. She spent hours late into the night perfecting the ritual, her hands moving in a trance. She was preparing the brushes that would touch Charity's skin, infusing them with the essence of her own desperation and the mirror's insatiable greed. She didn't notice that her own shadow in the candlelight looked increasingly skeletal, or that the sweet smell of her success had turned into the unmistakable odor of decay. She was too far gone, lost in the vision of her own eternal radiance. Tomorrow,
she whispered to the darkest corner of the room, where something seemed to be watching her with lidless eyes. Tomorrow, the mask becomes the face, and the sun will finally set for good. As the first hint of dawn touched the Acacia skyline, Ebele finally slumped into her velvet chair, her face a masterpiece of stolen beauty, waiting for the final harvest to begin. The grand ballroom of the Eco Hotel was a sea of shimmering gold, crystal chandeliers, and the restless hum of the Lagos elite. It was the night of the Ultimate Glow Expo, a competition meant to crown the greatest makeup artist in West Africa. The air was thick with the scent of expensive hairspray and the nervous energy of the finalists, but at the center of the storm stood Ebele. She looked more like a deity than a contestant, her skin vibrating with a stolen brilliance that made the other artists seem like charcoal sketches in her presence. Opposite her stood Charity, her face pale and weary from months of grieving for blessing, yet her eyes held a clarity that Ebele's lacked. As the timer began to count down, the room fell into a too quiet hush. Ebele reached for her forbidden palette, her movements stiff and rhythmic, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. She had convinced Charity to be her model under the guise of a reconciliation makeover, and as Charity sat in the chair, the ancient mirror she had smuggled into her station began to pulse beneath its velvet shroud. The first stroke of the brush was supposed to be the end, the final harvest that would make Ebele immortal. But as the bristles touched Charity's forehead, something went wrong. The masks began to slip. Instead of the golden vapor she expected, a cold, black mist began to leak from her own fingertips. The stolen beauty she had carefully layered over her soul was beginning to peel away like wet paint. In the reflection of the ballroom's grand mirrors, the audience didn't see the radiant queen of faces. They saw glimpses of a hollowed-out girl with sunken eyes and skin like gray ash. A gasp rippled through the crowd. "Look at her face!" someone whispered, the sound cutting through the air like a knife. Ebele panicked, her hands trembling as she tried to apply more pigment, but the colors on her palette had turned to the color of bruised flesh and stagnant water. Every time she tried to steal a spark from Charity, the light seemed to bounce off a wall of invisible purity and return to Ebele as a shadow. Charity looked up, her eyes meeting Ebele's in the mirror. She didn't look away in fear. She looked with a sad and beautiful pity that burned Ebele more than any insult. The cloying scent of jasmine in the room suddenly turned into the stench of something long dead. The lights of the ballroom flickered and groaned, and for a terrifying second, the reflection of everyone Ebele had ever harmed, Blessing, Amaka, Funke, appeared standing behind her in the glass, their faces eyeless and demanding. The high-stakes event was no longer a competition. It had become a public haunting. Ebele's mask was crumbling, and as the glamour faded, the true cost of her dark powers began to manifest for all of Lagos to see. The air in the grand ballroom grew unnaturally cold, a biting chill that bypassed the skin and settled deep in the marrow. As Ebele's stolen glamour continued to flake away like burnt paper, the massive ornate mirrors lining the walls began to ripple and groan. The surface of the glass didn't reflect the horrified socialites or the flashing cameras of the paparazzi anymore. Instead, the mirrors became windows into a dark, gray void. From the depths of the silvered glass, figures began to emerge, pale, ethereal, and hollow. These were the stolen women. Blessing led the silent procession, her face no longer youthful, but a translucent mask of grief, her eyes two pits of bottomless sorrow. Behind her came the others, a line of withered spirits, whose beauty had been the bricks of Ebele's empire. They didn't scream. The silence was too quiet, more terrifying than any outcry. They simply drifted forward, their feet never touching the plush hotel carpet, moving toward the stage with a slow, rhythmic inevitability. Ebele fell to her knees, clutching the forbidden pallet as if it could still protect her. "Stay back!" she hissed, her voice now cracked, aged rasp. But the spirits did not stop. They surrounded her in a circle of cold air, the scent of rotting jasmine rising from their spectral forms. Each spirit reached out a hand, not to strike, but to touch. As their fingers brushed against Ebele's skin, they didn't leave marks, they took back what was theirs. With every spectral touch, a piece of Ebele's stolen life vanished. The firmness of her jawline collapsed into sagging skin. The luster of her hair turned to brittle silver straw. The audience watched in a state of paralyzed shock as the Queen of Faces aged decades in a matter of seconds. The mirror she had brought, the ancient, twisted thing, began to crack, a spiderweb of fractures radiating from its center. A low, mocking laughter echoed from within the glass, the voice of the mirror spirit realizing the bargain was complete.
Charity stood frozen, her hand over her heart, watching as the beauty she had once envied was revealed to be a monstrous theft. She saw the spirits of her friends finally finding peace as their glow returned to them in the afterlife, leaving Ebele behind as a hollowed-out shell. The lights of the ballroom gave one final violent flicker and died, leaving the room in a darkness that felt like a cold and empty grave. When the emergency generators finally kicked in, the spirits were gone. All that remained on the stage was an old, unrecognizable woman weeping amidst a pile of shattered glass and dried black pigment. The reflection had finally claimed its due, and the price was everything Ebele had ever been. The sirens of the Lagos night wailed in the distance, but inside the ballroom a heavy, unnatural silence took hold. Ebele lay on the floor, a heap of tattered silk and brittle bones, surrounded by the jagged shards of the mirror that had once promised her the world. The emergency lights cast a sickly yellow hue over the scene, revealing the final, devastating truth. The woman on the stage was no longer 22. She was an ancient monument to greed, her skin draped over her frame like wet gray laundry, her eyes clouded with the milky film of cataracts. Charity stepped forward, her heart heavy with a sad and beautiful grief. She reached out a hand, but as she got closer, the shadows began to pool around Ebele's body like spilled ink. The air grew too quiet once more, and the cloying scent of jasmine was replaced by the smell of parched earth and old dust. The mirror spirit's bargain had reached its final clause. "I only wanted to be seen," Ebele whispered, her voice a dry rattle that barely carried across the stage. She looked at her hands, gnarled, trembling, and devoid of any light. She thought of her father's house, of the simple days before the mirror, and the warmth of a life that didn't require theft. But those memories were like smoke, slipping through her fingers. Suddenly, the cracks in the air itself seemed to widen. The darkness that Ebele had invited into her soul began to pull her inward. She didn't scream, she simply began to fade, her physical form becoming translucent and gray, like a sketch being erased from a page. The jealous stone in her chest finally shattered, and as it did, the remaining stolen life force she had clung to escaped in a final shimmering breath that drifted toward the ceiling. By the time the hotel security reached the platform, the velvet chair was empty. There was no Ebele, no Queen of Faces, only a dusting of black pigment and the lingering bitter cold of a shadow that had finally vanished into the night. Charity stood alone, the true sun of the Lagos beauty world, realizing that some people live a short life full of purpose, while others vanish into a long eternity of darkness.
Ebele had wanted the world to never forget her face, but in the end she had become a ghost with no face at all, consumed by the very vanity she had used to feed her soul. The ballroom was still, the lights flickered back to full strength, and for the first time in months the air in Acacia felt clean, the heavy scent of cursed jasmine finally washed away by the morning rain.